Hi friends, this is Jen and welcome back to another true crime video. Before we get started, please don't forget to click like and subscribe to my channel if you like this content. It really does help and it'll be super appreciated. This story starts on October 31st in 1992 when a 23-year-old woman by the name of Candace Fonagy goes to her local hospital in a town called Kipling in Canada. Candace had just had a pretty heated argument with her then boyfriend and she was going to go see her friend who was a nurse at this hospital. Unfortunately, when she gets there, Candace finds out that her friend isn't on duty that night and the nurse that is on duty recommends that Candace stay and see a physician before she goes because she's in such a worked up and upset state that the nurse is a bit concerned and doesn't want her to just leave. So Candace agrees and she's recommended to see a physician, and the one that was on duty that evening was Dr. John Schneeberger. I am so sorry if I mispronounced his name. Well, actually no. This doctor was just not a good person, so I am not sorry for pronouncing his name wrong. But it's Dr. John Schneeberger. I think that is how you pronounce it. I'm not sure. Please don't come at me. Anyways, John was a family physician and he was very well loved and well respected in the small town of Kipling. And this town wasn't all that big. It had a population of about 1,100 people. And most of the people who lived in this town were treated by John at one point or another. So almost everybody knew him and they just really respected him and thought he was a good doctor. When Candace went in to see John, she was expecting to receive a pill that she could just take orally and that this would help to calm her nerves. But instead she was given an injection, which probably wasn't the most appropriate in her situation. And after being given this injection by John, Candace suddenly becomes very numb and she begins to lose consciousness. She was given a drug called Verse, and this is a drug that's typically used to sedate people who are about to go into minor surgeries or do dental work. So the fact that she was given this is very suspicious because she wasn't going into a minor surgery. She wasn't getting dental work. She wasn't there for any of this. So she shouldn't have been given the sedation. And when Candace finally came to, she just knew right away that there was something off about this whole situation. She knew right away that she had been assaulted by the doctor. So when John had drugged Candace in the exam room, he probably figured two things. He figured that one, she wouldn't know what had happened because of the sedation that he gave her, or even if she did, no one would believe her. He believed that no one would believe Candace because she was a single mother with a high school diploma and she had a job working at a gas station and just had a reputation as a pretty big partier. So in the town that they were living in, Candace was looked down upon by the other town members. So of course, knowing all this, John in his head thinks who would ever take her word against his. John was a charming medical professional in his 30s and he had a really good reputation in the town. He actually helped the town raise funds so that they could build a public swimming pool, and a lot of people, especially the families in that area, went to him for medical assistance. He was well known and well respected by the town members, and this was unfortunately not the case for Candace. John was also a family man. He was happily married with 4 kids, 2 of which were his stepchildren from his wife's previous marriage. So with all of this in mind, he really thought that he would be able to get away with it, and that would actually turn out to be true for quite a few years. After the assault, Candace, again knowing full well what had happened to her, she went straight away to the police to report the assault. Semen and DNA were found on Candace, so you'd think that this was a pretty open and shut case, but nope. Not at all. This would turn out to be an incredibly frustrating and long road to justice for Candace. The officers who Candace had reported the assault to then went to visit John and told him about the report made by Candace, and they started to just question him. And during the questioning, John volunteered happily, actually. He volunteered very happily to provide DNA samples to the police so that they could use it to compare to the samples that were collected from Candace. And just as all the townspeople who had known about this had expected, the DNA didn't match what was found on Candace. The test results seemed to confirm to the townspeople that Candace was completely lying about everything and that she had just made this all up. People began to theorize that Candace had actually had a crush on John and that she had tried to approach him, and him, being a good family man, had rejected her, and that this was now her retaliation towards John. Some residents even suspected that Candace had come up with this lie to profit from this through a potential lawsuit. John's wife, Lisa, well, his wife at that time, even went on TV and called Candace a not so very nice name. Starts with an S and ends with a T. And so yeah, everyone just stood by John. Like, no one even doubted his innocence. Everyone just took him by his word and just believed that he was totally innocent. John had maintained that he only gave Candace the injection Versed because it would help to calm her nerves, but that the drugs sometimes could cause hallucinations of sexual activity and that was just a side effect. However, bless Candace, she knew what had happened to her and she wasn't going to give up very easily. So a year later, in August 1993, the doctor agreed to take a second DNA test at the request of Candace. This time, the test would be monitored by police witnesses. But again, the doctor's DNA didn't match the DNA that was found on Candace on the night of the assault. Luckily, Candace wasn't going to back down. She knew exactly what happened to her on that Halloween night and she wasn't going to give up. So she decides to hire a private investigator. Candace hires a private investigator to get a sample of John's DNA so that she could take it to a private lab to have it tested. And just as an FYI, DNA tests can be taken either through a cheek swab or through a blood sample. So blood samples are not the easiest things to get a hold of, especially if you're trying to do it very discreetly, because people tend to notice if you go up to them trying to jab them with objects and trying to take their blood, right? So the investigator then decides to do something much easier. He decides to break into John's car and he decides to steal John's chapstick. And what do we find when we run the chapstick through DNA testing? Surprise, surprise, the sample perfectly matched the sample that was collected from Candace on the night of her assault. And fortunately, this was enough for Candace to launch a civil trial against John, and this is where he agrees to take one more DNA test. During the test, the technician attempted to draw blood from John's finger, but John insisted that they take it from his arm. However, the technician really struggled to get the blood from his vein, despite there being a lot of blood there, which was weird and should have been questioned, but I guess there was nothing the technician could really do about it, or I don't know how that works. So they just took it from his arm, and it turned out that the sample that was taken from John was so little that there wasn't enough for DNA testing, and the case again fell apart and was closed in 1994. However, in April of 1997, there was a massive break in the case. Lisa, who's John's wife, came out with a shocking statement. Lisa had discovered that her husband had been drugging and assaulting her 13-year-old daughter from her previous marriage. Lisa came forward to allege that John would inject his stepdaughter with a drug and at night would go in to assault her. This time, when police officers went in to question him, they took samples of his hair and blood from his finger and not from the vein on his arm. And unlike the blood from his arm, the DNA that was collected from his finger was a perfect match. They now know they finally have the right man, but officers are really confused as to why the DNA is matching now but didn't match all the other times before. In November of 1999, John goes on trial for the assault of both Candace and his stepdaughter. And in the trial, John confesses to the method that he used to evade the blood analysis. He had cheated the DNA test by providing the police with a blood sample that belonged to one of his patients. And he did this by storing the patient's blood in his own arm. John had basically implanted a 15-centimeter Penrose drain filled with a patient's blood, and then he put that into his arm in order to trick the DNA test. He would then also use blood thinners to essentially circulate the other man's blood within his arm. And it turns out that the third blood sample that was taken for Candace's case was insufficient because he was basically running out of that man's blood, and it was over 2 years old at this point. However, John had the audacity to claim that he did all all of this in self-defense. He stated that Candace had broken into his house in the middle of the night and had stolen a used condom in order to frame him. Luckily, the jury didn't buy this, and he was convicted of enough crimes to put him away for essentially forever. But for some reason, the Canadian justice system didn't want to put him away forever. They decided to only give him 6 years. He received 6 years in prison for drugging and assaulting a patient and his own stepdaughter. I don't know how that makes sense, but that's what happened. What's even crazier here, though, is that after 4 years in minimum security at the Ferndale Institution in British Columbia, John was released on parole. He spent 4 years and was released for drugging and assaulting women, like a minor as well. I don't understand it, but that's what happened. And as soon as John gets out on parole, he then decides to move to a town called Regina. And unfortunately, this is the same town that poor Candace is living in. Imagine finally getting justice for something so horrible that happened to you, only to have this man get out early and then move to the same town that you're living in. Like, that must have been a nightmare for her, and I feel so bad for her. And at this point, John had had his medical license taken away in Canada, so he had to work on like a demolition crew and worked on carpentry and just odd jobs. Luckily, John wasn't there for too long though. John was originally from Zambia, and records show that he had neglected to disclose to the Canadian government during his Canadian citizenship application in 1993 that he was undergoing a sexual assault investigation. So as a result of this, John was in direct violation of the terms of his citizenship. This led the Canadian government to make the decision to deport him from Canada. And surprisingly, during all of this, John still had a lot of fans, especially from Kipling. So because John had violated the terms of his citizenship, and he was now being deported back to South Africa, his friends began a letter writing campaign to urge the immigration minister to essentially reverse the deportation orders so that John could then have a chance to say goodbye to his young daughters, age 5 and 6. Lisa, who's now John's ex-wife, was ordered to allow John to see their daughters. And Lisa, very reasonably so, did try to disobey this order previously, but then had to pay a $2,000 fine to the court for refusing to take her daughters into the jail to see John. But because she didn't want any more trouble, she ultimately decided to obey the new orders and did bring them to say goodbye to John. It's so gross to me that the court deemed it okay to only give John 6 years in prison for assaulting a patient and then his young stepdaughter. Like, how is that okay? And then I find it even grosser that they think it's okay to force Lisa to bring in their young daughters after everything that John's done, to even let him be near them. Like, that's just so gross to me. He shouldn't have been around those children. He shouldn't have been allowed to be around those children. He shouldn't be allowed to be around anyone at this point. Lisa was certainly not happy to have him meet the young girls, and even made the following statement to the press. It was also reported that some of John's friends actually did still believe that he was innocent, and they even threw him a going away party before he left to South Africa. He even had time to do a garage sale to get rid of the things that he had prior to being deported. It literally just sounds like he's about to casually just move countries and not like he's about to be deported. Like, it's just so weird. But yeah. Luckily, when John goes back to South Africa, things start to become quite challenging for him. While John was known as Dr. John in Canada, when he went to South Africa, he was known as Dr. Rape. I mean, they're not wrong, so. When arriving in South Africa, John decided that he wanted to go back into the medical field. So he decides that he's going to apply for the Health Professions Council of South Africa so that he could go and work in some fields of medicine again. But shortly after submitting the application, he quickly withdrew his application. I'm guessing that John quickly realized that no one would ever trust him again or take him seriously in the field of medicine. And thank God he didn't make it back into that field, because there was a good chance he would have just continued to do the same things again. I don't think he was a changed man, so I'm so happy that he wasn't able to be around patients or in that type of a role again. So back in South Africa, John has a brother named Bill, and Bill is a surgeon. And Bill believes that John is completely innocent. Bill maintained that the charges against his brother were false, and he said that his brother wasn't a saint. Sure, definitely not a saint, but he also wasn't a fool to assault a patient in an exam room. Believing that his brother was innocent, Bill did try to help get John back on his feet professionally, but that didn't really seem to go anywhere. As for John, he went on to live with his mother in Durban, South Africa, and he now works in the catering industry. Apparently, he developed skills in that industry through working on kitchen duty while he was in prison. And since then, he's laid pretty low and there hasn't been anything new about him. So let's hope that that continues to be the case. As for Candace, she did file a civil suit against John as well as the hospital that he had worked at. I'm not sure what the outcome of that had been, but other than that, she's just been living her life and she's happily married and now works as a continuing care assistant for an addiction services facility. So she seems to have done pretty well in her life. I'm really happy to know that Candace is now happily married and she's going in a good direction and she's thriving, hopefully. What happened to her and Lisa's daughter was just insane, and it's something that no one should ever have to go through. I also hope that Lisa's daughter is okay. Yeah, John is a big piece of shit. I'm just gonna say it. And I think it's beyond ridiculous that John only served 4 years in prison for committing something so gross and so traumatizing. And now he's just out and about and freely living his life. He's a menace to society and should have never been allowed to just be around other people, to be honest. Anyways, thanks so much for tuning in to this video, and again, if you guys like this content, please click like and subscribe, and I hope to see you guys in next week's video. Bye!